Hello, I'm George Oakes. I am both the host, director, and producer of the Rights and Wrongs podcast. One of the main missions of our podcast here is to educate and help defeat against the misconception of buzzwords. Throughout this podcast, you're going to hear me mix up patriarchy and matriarchy a lot, which is a very serious issue. However, I decided to leave it in there just for the fact that it shows that politics is messy and we make mistakes. I'm only human, and so is everyone else. So if someone does misuse a word, don't get angry at them, and hopefully educate them. That being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of this podcast, and if you like us, subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to us, and I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the third episode of Rights and Wrongs podcast. I'm George Oakes. I'm your host. Today we're going to be talking about feminism and Marxism theory in politics. I'm joined today by Ellen Stirling and Molly Young. I will let them introduce themselves. You wanted to go first, Ellen?
Yeah. So hi, I'm Ellen. I'm currently studying towards a Master's in International Relations at the University of Glasgow, but my background is actually in meteorology and climate science. So kind of different. I got into IR kind of when I took an intro to IR class when I was in the US studying abroad, kind of fell in love with the course. So yeah, so that's what kind of brought me here.
Awesome. Molly?
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm currently studying for a Master's in International Relations as well. My undergrad is actually history and politics, so kind of similar to IR. My academic focuses tend to focus on the rise and fall of populism in the West and how that intersects with the debates on race and feminism. So pretty like what we're going to debate today. But yeah.
All right, and so the huge thing about this is when I started is we're going to talk about feminism theory, and feminism theory is a little bit different than feminism politics, as people know. Like, you do have the equal rights movement and part of like human rights of feminism pushing for men and women equality, and that can be seen both ways. Feminist theory in politics, just like feminist theory of interviewing, is very different, even though it holds a lot of similarities to it at the same time.
Yeah, so specifically talking about feminism in international relations, which I think is what me and Ellen both are, not experts, but have more of an understanding in, focuses on challenging the epistemological and ontological foundations of more traditional IR theories such as realism and liberalism, and tries to put in a gendered lens, look at how women fit into the international system, but also how the international system itself is heavily based on androcentric concepts, looking at how like masculinity is associated with autonomy, sovereignty, the capacity for reason and objectivity, whereas feminism is linked to irrationality, and how by taking a gendered lens we actually contest this idea that is prevalent in those traditional theories. Briefly.
Yeah.
Brief summary. Don't know if you want to add anything, Ellen.
Yeah, only a couple of things. I think we kind of covered most of sort of basics of feminist theory. One of the important things that I always think about is feminist theory. You hear the word feminist and you think it's like one sort of unified concept, whereas actually within feminism itself, you have lots of different strands like liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, which we'll kind of touch on as well, constructive feminism, and post-colonial feminism, just to name a few, who all focus on different things within feminism that are obviously very similar, very related, focused on women, focused on equality, however, address the different needs of different women, I suppose. One of the big things we'll talk about as well is Western feminism and like some of the issues with that, which we'll discuss later on as well.
All right, so what was the first case you guys wanted to talk about? Like, how does this actually play in politics? Because there's one thing about theory, there's another thing about practice.
Well, I suppose, like I was just saying, Western feminism is a big thing, big issue. When we talk about Western feminism, we're referring to sort of let's say traditional feminism, as you probably like all women should be equal, and everything like that. It kind of came out of the, women's rights and everything, that kind of thing. However, within that, there's some issues whereby by considering women as one sort of like monolithic idea. So all women are the same and all women are unified against, I suppose, opposed to men, or at a, like, they are battling against men in their ways to try and get equality. They all suffer from the same issues and they all agree on the same way. Whereas actually in reality, women are very obviously different. Like women like me and Molly obviously are from the UK. We're very different than a woman, let's say, in the Middle East, or the woman in South America or Australia, for even. Like they are we all have different perceptions of the world and different, I suppose, needs and stuff. And the perception of Western feminism onto other cultures can be really detrimental for women of other cultures. I know Molly could probably expand a bit more on this, but it's about women wearing hijabs, and there's a whole issue where, like, you see a woman wearing a hijab and you may think she's being oppressed, when actually that's just a choice of hers to wear a hijab, and that has to be respected. But Western feminism kind of overlooks that, I suppose.
Do you have anything to add to that, Molly?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Ellen was saying, that feminism it needs to be a conversation, not a static theory, because if we reduce it down to a single theory, we lose and alienate other women across the globe. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that Western feminism does, that we really don't want to be doing that, especially when it's a critique of traditional theories that do that already. It's like, if we reduce it down to that single definition, who gets left out? Like, to make this like a workable definition, mm-hmm. It needs to be a continued conversation. And with the hijab, we don't have the right from our position to tell another woman what is okay. Like, if that's her choice, I wouldn't think of myself as a feminist if I then took that away from her. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there isn't male oppression within these religions, because we can see that there is. But we don't want to turn a patriarchy into a matriarchy.
Well, the one thing I find funny, I shouldn't say funny, but it's really interesting when clothing in politics is a very strange concept. And while I was doing some research and going over things, I actually strangely came across like a comedic video about talking about an ancient culture from Crete. I'm not sure if you know about this. This is like from like ancient Greek time. Like, these people traded with the Greeks around the time of like Alexander the Great. And you talk about like the oppression of like not showing ankles. Like, oh, the Middle East doesn't show ankles, but then you'll get to like some Asian cultures or South American cultures where it's just perfectly okay for women not to have tops on. But if you look at the clothing stature of all the paintings and like the statues they have of the women from this culture, it was written in their culture women were not allowed to show their legs, so they had to have huge dresses, but none of their clothing was allowed to cover up their bust. So it was like, it's kind of strange, because like people think of like cultural things, like, oh, you can't, like, how you have to cover up that part, but like, oh, don't be too shrewd. Like, this culture kind of just wanted to like mess with modern day society 5,000 years ago, and it shows the argument of like where clothing gets to. It's so strange, and like how we do talk about culture, and like it's a conversation that needs to be had. It's just when you're talking about that, that's just something that popped in my head.
Yeah, there's been conversations about if a woman from the West goes to the Middle East, a country is more liberal because they're allowed to wear a skirt in that country and show their legs. And because of that, they're more, they're more feminist and more liberal. But it's like, actually, it's not always the case. Like, we have to respect other people's like intersectionality of culture and race and gender. And, like, we have to think where they all intersect.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to say, it's also interesting too, because when you look at like Saudi Arabia, when you're talking about stuff like that, Saudi Arabia made this big deal that we now let women drive. Oh my God, give us a round of applause. We let women drive. They're still not allowed to leave their house. They still have to wear hijabs. They're not allowed to vote or own property, but we let them drive. So they want a pat on the back, which is another strange way that it got politicized.
Yeah.
Sorry, I digress.
No,
Yeah.
it's like we've won because women are able to show their legs in that particular country, and it's like, no, there's so much more to be done. And sometimes
definitely.
it's like deciding where to find the battles.
Yeah, I think as well, like sometimes feminism can definitely, obviously not in a theoretical sense, but like in a more sense that people, let's say feminism that people know and understand, they see it as like women are just a cheat trying to look for very specific, like very small things as like a reward. Like it's like, woohoo, women in Saudi Arabia can drive, that's great. But like there's a lot of bigger issues and a lot of bigger problems at play here that aren't being addressed because it's like we'll just go and deal with this small issue instead of dealing with the big ones, I suppose.
Which a lot of times is, I always feel like that's the matriarchal way of drawing lines. And like, this is the strength, like, this is why it's so important to understand, like, I feel learning about feminist theory, it's so fascinating because the world is so controlled by masculine styles of government that we're measuring success and progress by masculine styles. And like a prime example where like, if people aren't familiar with the difference between like masculine styles and feminist styles, the way that we're looking at the COVID crisis compared to the space race are two perfect examples. As if you look at the nations that are winning, they are winning, and even though this shouldn't be a competition, but the countries that are doing the best with COVID-19 are feminist style and female-led countries, such as New Zealand, because these countries are looking at the issue that, okay, we're doing better than everyone else, but we continue to do better. We're not just better than doing it in Australia, but we can do better on our own. Like, I find it fascinating that New Zealand, seeing that they got 2 new cases of coronavirus in their country as a complete failure, where the United States would be jumping for joy if that's what they had. And they thought they would be winning. Like, it's a very strange thing, but then comparing it to the space race, people look at it like we're talking about Saudi Arabia, prime example. They decided where the victory line was. If you look at America versus Russia, it's like Russia beat us at everything. They put the first living thing, poor puppy, first humans were up there, first satellite, they beat us everything. We just got the first man on the moon, declared victory. Awesome. Russia pulled out of the race, and then fast forward nearly 60 years, we're finally making progress. Like, our technology is now making progress to go back to the moon because we weren't competing against another outside force. We're feminist theory, and I feel bad because like now I'm mansplaining the thing. I'm just trying to talk to my listeners.
No, like, it just shows how important like feminist theory is to global politics. I think that we are challenging what is acceptable knowledge and what deserves to be studied. And I think for so long it has been how powerful states are and how states interact with each other and how they've got to have this world hegemony. Whereas taking it back to COVID and you're seeing these like female leaders actually taking on something that hasn't been discussed on like the global like arena, and the androcentric nature of the international system has completely neglected health crisis. And this is possible reason why those female leaders are actually doing better in this sort of circumstance.
Yeah,
because
definitely. I think
not involved in this like masculinity of it.
I agree. I think there is a big thing about, kind of spoke about this before, but it's like when you're women leaders are more focused on like improving the I suppose the concept of a nanny state, which obviously has female connotations in itself, where women leaders generally are more inclined to try and protect their like the poorest and the weakest in their society. I think I agree, like the COVID crisis really highlights that. It's like countries with female leaders, it's obviously a bit of a stereotype. You don't necessarily know if that's like an accurate thing to say, but like they are often the ones that are doing better in this crisis than the ones led by men who maybe trying to compete. I suppose again, it's all competition, isn't it? So it's like trying to compete with other countries to be the best when neglecting the actual need to address the issue within the country themselves.
No, that's true. One thing I also do want for the listeners to understand is it can get really confusing at this point. We're not saying that feminist theory politics only happen when women are in charge.
No, yeah.
It's just...
No, absolutely not.
There are usually run. It's just the problem is this. You can go back to the whole entire, because the whole argument nature versus nurture, and this is possibly mostly based off nurture. The fact men are raised in the idea of toxic masculinity, competition is goal. Like most men are raised in sports, and this. It's like you find a goal, you defeat the goal. The goal is defeated, and then you leave it away and walk away. And that's masculine style of government. As I use the space race as an example, where women are raised differently, so their approach in their problem solving to the issues are, okay, cool, we're stopping COVID-19, we're better than other countries, but we still haven't solved the problem. And that's where we're talking about it. And a prime examples of this we discussed before. Just because someone's a female politician doesn't mean that they are always feminist in their practice. We talked a lot about Hillary Clinton in this matter, and it's like not really her fault. It's just that. And there probably are examples, I can't think of any and I can't find any, of feminist male politicians. I just want to make sure people aren't getting confused by that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is like you have to stress that feminism isn't just a theory for women. It places gender into the conversation and ensures that both men and women are taken into account. It doesn't seek to eliminate men. And I think that's where it gets a really bad rap sometimes, is that they see it as only women will be part of the conversation from now on. And I think that's what alienates a lot of people from it.
Yeah, definitely. As well, I think feminism, especially when you compare it to other theories of international relations, so like liberalism and realism, feminism looks beyond the state level. So it's trying to understand how, like, it's trying to reduce inequality within the state instead of competing outside of the state. That's a big factor in it, not necessarily inequality between men and women, but also inequality between, the poorest in society and the richest, or, different, or racial inequality. That it covers a lot of different grounds that aren't just about gender, which I think is important to think about as well, that I know a lot of people may be surprised by as well.
No, that's true. And it's like such a strange thing. You can dive into any theory about this, because white feminism is a thing, Latino feminism is a thing, Arab feminism is a thing. Studying human rights, it's actually really amazing how human rights language can be used against feminist movements, such as, like, you can use human rights language to say that technically abortions are against human rights. Like, people do that with the ECHR. Here in the UK, there's movements about that abortion's against human rights because it doesn't protect life. And that's like a lot of conversations that like people need to have and really understand feminism.
Yeah, I think it just goes to like what Ellen was saying at the beginning, that it has multiple strands and you really do harm the cause if you try and bring it into this single definition. And just repeating, like, you will alienate women across the world if we just go to the Western feminist definition. And I think that just stunts the cause.
No, it really does. Did you have something to add to that, Ellen?
No, I totally agree. I think I would have said the exact same thing, but I also think, I suppose you could say, especially when you focus on Western feminism, if you take that as the one thing, you then suppress all the other feminisms. Like, by saying Western feminism is like a dominant feminist approach, you then are like saying that all the other ones is a form of almost inequality in itself by taking this one form of feminism, which then kind of arguably goes against the whole idea of feminism in itself, which is quite interesting.
Well, yeah, that's the whole entire. It goes always back to the argument of because feminism is based off the argument of gender, and gender is a construct. Like that, like, gender isn't found in nature. Like, yes, you'll have those people going like, "Oh, there's only two genders." No, there's two sexes. They're like there's multiple. Gender is a fluid thing, and people would argue against it. It's like if you've ever like any person that says they're like a guy getting in touch with their feminist side, that's you admitting there's gender is a fluid thing. There's no such thing as like you could take the most manly men ever, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm sure he is in touch with his feminine side. Like I'm sure he is. But that's where like I think a lot of it when it comes to it. But that's me coming from the male point of view on a lot of things. So I know I have a stagnant view. One question I did want to ask you girls, women, sorry. Are there any parts of feminism that you find toxic or dangerous?
Yeah, I feel like I'd just be kind of repeating what I've already said, because I do think Western feminism has a lot of toxic traits, like we've already touched on upon. And I'm not saying that Western feminism isn't okay for Western feminists, because it absolutely is. It's the right way to approach things. But I just think when you try and create a universal concept of woman, it just brings up this alienation again. And I think this is why post-colonial theories and feminist theories that touch upon like intersectionality are so important, because you need to understand that there is different parts of someone's personality and culture and history that need to be taken into account. And if we do just approach it from a feminist perspective, we eliminate so many issues. That would be my main argument.
I suppose I've got a sort of practical example where that kind of works, because for my dissertation I'm writing about natural disaster vulnerability and like gender, the issue. So like basically the underlying concept that literature's found previously is that women are generally more vulnerable to natural disasters than men are. That's not just because they're women, that's because of a lot of other issues to do with their social class, I suppose would be the word. Social class, their economic capabilities. Women generally earn less than men, so are more likely to be in poverty. Like there's a lot of layers to these issues, and like there's examples in specific countries where, you know, in Sri Lanka in the 2004 tsunami, for example, they found that because men went out and fished whilst women worked in the home, they were more likely to die because they were in the I suppose like right at the oceanfront when the tsunami hit, whilst the men were at sea and were safe. So like there's a lot of different things and different dynamics that work into what a woman is and what makes them either necessarily in a more unequal in a society than just the fact that they're a woman. And that's a big thing that Western feminism misses or like overlooks, I suppose. So yeah, I would say that's probably the only issue I would find with feminism, or like with that strand of feminism, I suppose.
From an outsider, I have always had kind of two issues with feminism where I see things. And this is like the one thing, like as an outsider, me trying to learn. One, there's a conversation that I feel like that's never really had because it almost seems to, it's an argument conversation that needs to be had, but I understand why it's not had. And that's like how people don't talk about how the world as we know is physically built as a man's world. And like there's certain things people argue, it's like, oh, a door is built so high because like this is the average size of a guy. Like I understand, like men and women both have to walk through a door, but take power tools, or you're talking about boats, or my personal experience is military equipment when I was in the Marines. The average rifle, combat kit, flak jacket, and all that stuff is built for a man's body, average men's height. And I'm not just talking like, oh, because a man's bigger, and their hands are bigger. It's like the flak jackets put the weight on the shoulders because that's where men hold their weight. You put that on a female Marine, I'm not calling it, like that's not how their body's built. The second they came around with the new generation of flak jackets with the cummerbund that put the weight on the hips, us as the men were like, oh, this is nice, because it takes some of the weight off the shoulders, but the female Marines loved it because it's actually built for them. You can see the same thing in music where pianos are made for a man's head, harps are made for men's arms reach. And like, even though these might be musical instruments dominated by the women in the field, they're still at a handicap because it's built to make it easier for men. And when you're talking about that, when it comes to like situations of like hurricanes, like that's what pops in my mind when you're talking about like difficulties, like, oh, they need to build. And I'm thinking about the tools, like jackhammers, all stuff. Like, I worked as a welder for a while. The machines aren't built easily for a woman to move around. And it's like, oh, just get over it. It's like, or we could just build something that's, because if you make it easier for someone that's of a smaller build to move it, you're also making it easier for me. I'm not going to complain if you make a welding machine lighter. I don't see it makes my life easier. That's one conversation. The other conversation, like, is the word feminist to begin with? Because I've always felt like people hear the word feminist, like, oh, female, and they instantly become hostile to it. Like, one thing I'd say is the manist movement, where the manist movement's trying to argue, like, oh, we want certain things, which some of it's like, they want parental leave. They want more custody. It's like, these are conversations that you don't have to be aggressive towards feminists. It's part of the feminist movement that I feel like a lot of people don't understand. I'm not sure if you guys disagree or agree with those two statements.
I would just say that I think what your first point is, you're absolutely right. Like, global politics is 100% built for a man. But this is why feminism is so important, because it starts to actually see where women fit into this system and how important they are to the system, where they're found, trying to say, like, why isn't a woman found in these positions? Why are they kept out of this? And it's finding those things like the power tools and stuff like that, the practical issues, and finding a way for a woman to be included. But it's such a important conversation because it is addressing these different gender identities, that there's certain things that are typically male, typically female, and we need to combat those things to put women back into the narrative. You're talking about Hillary Clinton, and she's like the perfect example. Like, you look at her presidential campaign, and like, for my undergrad dissertation, I looked at political cartoons during the run-up to the election, and the way that she's drawn about compared to Trump, she has to fit into this androcentric role, that she's got to be tough, she's got to be strict, but she's also then got to be sincere and a mother. She has to find her place within two roles, and it's just been like taking it back and thinking about that and being like, why does she have to fit in to both? Or why, if she has certain personalities, does that make her more male? And yeah, just thinking about what and changing the places that women can be in the international system.
Yeah, prime example of what you're talking about, which I always find fascinating, is I know a few people that have they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton on the pure basis that, like, I will never vote for a woman that stood by a man that cheated on her. Like, okay, that's an argument, but she was running against Donald Trump, who was caught on tape sexually harassing and assaulting women. And it's like, oh my God, she tried to stay with her husband. Bill Clinton is Bill Clinton. That's just how it is. I'm not saying like that is what it is. That's the history. But she's trying to make it work, stay with a husband. But you're saying, like, how dare her try to stick to your normal conforms that, like, the world used to be built on? But you're perfectly okay with a walking grabby machine.
Absolutely. It's just these two different standards that women and men have to, be. Yeah. Or they get away with.
Did you have anything to add to that, Ellen?
No, I was also gonna bring up Hillary Clinton because I think she's a prime example of a woman in politics who has had to shift to deal with being in a man's world. I think I've also done some research into I suppose gender and foreign policy, and so I was looking at her period of time when she worked in politics, and it was like researchers found that over time her way of speaking and her way of communicating has become more transitioned to a more masculine way of dealing with things. So the way she speaks and everything is shifted from being, I suppose, just how she is to a more masculine way, just because it's likely because she's in a room full of a lot of men. And it's not always necessarily about having women in the room, but it's about having women in the room who are then listened to and then are allowed to contribute. It's not, because it's all fine and well if you have a woman. So it's like saying, oh, we've got a woman, great, we've ticked the box. But if you don't actually allow her to then deal with things and contribute to decisions and do what she needs to do, then it's not making any difference, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. I've also heard a lot of arguments where it's interesting you talk about ticking on the box, where we have like affirmative action in the United States. I'm sure you have similar things here where people, I always get annoyed, but people just get hired because of their ethnicity, their gender, their religion, and whatnot. And it's really interesting where it's like, that's one thing we kind of need to force in there, because yes, I agree with the statement where a lot of people mean like equal opportunity doesn't mean equal result. But the problem is that until we get a few equal results, we're never going to have equal opportunity. Like it's an equation, and it's a complicated, messy one. But one of the places where equal opportunity should not apply is the ballot box. That's the reason I always find it interesting. Like, I'm going to vote for this person because factor that really doesn't mean anything there. Because, like, yes, like as we've been talking about before, most women that use feminist theory in politics, which is amazing, are women. But just because you're a woman doesn't mean you use feminist theory. Like, my favorite politician living here in Scotland, I love Nicola Sturgeon, because she breaks the boundaries of patriarchy, because I love when you watch a video with her and she does the exact opposite of what Boris Johnson or Trump will do, where someone asks her a question, oh, I don't know the answer to that, especially like medical or coronavirus, and turns to the leader of the Scottish Medical Society or something like that. She's like, I do not know, let me get the best qualified person for you. That's leading. Like, that is, but you ask Donald Trump, you can literally see quotes that I'm the smartest person in the world, and I'm sorry that you're inferior to me. It's like, that's not leading. That's ego busting.
Yeah, and he's got to seem like the most masculine person in the room.
Yeah.
Like, if I don't know this, that is like a sense of weakness to him.
Yeah.
Where it shouldn't be seen as a sense of weakness.
It goes back to the double standard, because it talks about, like, when I talk to a lot of my friends about the fact that we're talking about how things are not made for women, the second you start talking about things how they are made for women, a lot of women refuse to use it because it shows weakness. And that's the strange thing. It's just like, oh, I'm not going to use the power tool that's smaller built for my hand because that shows that I'm weak and I need to be taken care of. And that's how men are going to see me. But if you handed the guy that power tool, he has no problem complaining about it's being too small. I can't use this. This isn't built for me. And people be like, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's such a strange.
I suppose that comes back to the whole thing about sort of performative feminism. In a way, like, it's like, oh, we'll give you a power tool that's fit for women, or we'll let women drive. But you're still not dealing with the underlying issues within feminism, or the issues that women or minorities face within a society. You're just dealing with like the small things. I think off women, but it was to do with the Black Lives Matter recently. It was like they removed an episode of a TV program, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, that had, I think it had blackface in it, and they removed that from Netflix. And it's like, that's great, good, glad that's happening, but that wasn't dealing with the core issues that Black Lives Matter or any other movement is trying to deal with. It's just almost a performative thing.
No, and that's the interesting thing too, because like there is a lot about that, and it's like, okay, you're erasing. It's like interesting when you bring up like that whole stuff, when you could take away all the videos of like there's so much old television, old movies that normalize sexual assault, sexual harassment, all that. And that's like great if you take it all the way. But at the same point, you take it all the way, you're erasing history, and you're basically, those that do not learn from our history are doomed to repeat it. Like, I know personally, growing up in an era, I grew up in an all-white neighborhood for a while. Like, when I went to elementary school, there was the one Arab kid and one African-American kid. Other than that, 600, I was one of the few non-Catholic kids. Like, that's just how it was. But it's structure. I wasn't going to like a private school. It's just how society was. So when I was told as a guy, like, we had the Women's March, women's suffrage, sexism's over. Oh, okay. You had the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King said some stuff. We had the Civil War. Racism's over. Like, oh, okay. Like, I don't have people like arguing or telling me. And that's a lot of what you're talking about. Just, if we don't have the discussion, it's there. But we still do need to make I'm one of those things, like, we still need to make the tools, but we also have to take away the stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's all about educating people on why, not just taking it away, because then you're not understanding why it's being taken away. You have to have these discussions so people actually understand the reasoning behind it.
Mm-hmm. I suppose as well, you could argue as well, like, this whole idea of recognizing what's happened in history kind of links to Marxism, I think, because that's a big thing in Marxism. Marxist theory, obviously, when people hear Marxism, they have a certain association with it. But like, Marxism in international relations is the concept that like these core ideas in society have developed are dependent on the particular social and historical conditions that came before them, instead of like things have just appeared. It's like, which is in some lot of traditional theories, like realism and liberalism, the ones I refer to a lot because they're like the core IR theories that were like the founders, I suppose. They don't do that. It's more like this happens and then this happens and this happens. It's not like all these things link together and sort of flow together, which is a big thing in Marxism as well. And I think feminism also kind of draws on that, but is not as focused on that aspect of it as Marxism is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's putting like subjectivity back into a topic that has been based on objective knowledge.
Yeah, definitely.
Knowledge needs to be taken as it is. This is how we almost like decided that it is, and this is how it's going to be. Whereas everybody views knowledge from their own lenses and their own subjectivity, and you need to put that back into politics and theory.
No, and it's fascinating too, because you also like talking about that when people talk about these theories. Marxism's a clear example, because you hear Marxism, people jump straight to like communism, but it's like communism and socialism are two different theories. They're close to each other. Like, yes, communism is a form of socialism, but they're not the same way that a monarchy is a dictatorship, but they're not the same. Like, there's similarities, but major differences. But people latch onto these buzzwords. Like, they hear feminism and they just like attach to something. And that's always like saying, like, one of the bad things I always have an issue. Like, I think it's not really an issue. Like, with feminism, is the word feminism is like means woman. So people think it goes exactly into trying to turn a matriarchy into a patriarchy. Because people make the same argument for like civil rights in the United States, where they're like, oh, they're trying to go from white supremacy to black supremacy. And it's like, no, that's not what, like, the civil rights movement is fighting white supremacy. They're not, like, that's where I don't understand where people try and mix these two motions. But people see the word feminist and they just assume, and like, that's just from like an outward perspective when I talk to people, and that's where they get really nervous about it. And I find it a little sad, because the negative connotation to like feminism, you see the positive towards neoliberalism, where people say neo, oh, that means new, I know what that is. And liberal, oh, liberals are good, where all it is just a more aggressive capitalism. It's just capitalism in a new shiny bow that like, here, have. I didn't actually send the question to you guys when you're forward, and I feel bad about that. Oh, that's also, you can talk about that. Well, I've heard of people would say, guys, is there any form of feminism that you feel that doesn't get the light that it should be, doesn't get addressed, like it's kind of thrown to the corners that we haven't already talked about?
I suppose since the opposite of Western feminism is the thing, like obviously we're talking a lot about it, and like I certainly hope that a lot of people that are listening to it are like, oh, that makes sense. Like, why would we support Western feminism? Why don't we support it as alternative post-colonial feminism, I suppose? But I would say post-colonial feminism is something that definitely gets overlooked and is relatively new to IR theory. So it's still it's kind of progressing, it's kind of building its own base. And obviously it's an intersection of post-colonial theory and then feminism. So it's trying to addressing, again, it's trying to get past this issue of women as a one concept. So I think that's definitely something I would say is being overlooked currently in feminism, and I hope that it doesn't in future. So.
Yeah. Controversially, I think right-wing feminism gets
definitely
overlooked, and obviously when you think about them two concepts together, they seem like they are two phrases that should not be put together. And I think this goes into what areas of feminism do you find toxic? And I think it's when feminists can be aggressive, and if you're not following their specific doctrine, then you can't be a feminist. But feminist is all about, for me anyway, equality of choice, that they should be allowed to have this choice without being threatened by other women. So if a woman decides that they want to be in the household, that should be something that we support, rather than telling them that the only reason they're doing that is because of the patriarchy. I think it become a very entangled discussion, because obviously sometimes women are pushed into the household because of the man, but at the same time we shouldn't be telling women this is their specific way to live their life. And that this goes to Western feminists towards other women in the West, but also again to Western feminists in within post-colonial theory, and then in developing countries and stuff like that. It's vice versa.
Yeah, that's just fascinating, because when you talk about that, I feel like almost every political issue, especially in Western philosophies, when we look at politics, there's either this way or that way, and you can't be in the middle. And it's just, when you talk about how, and it is sad, a lot of women will get attacked because it's oh, you have a child, yet you're giving up your career to stay at home and take care of your child. How dare you? You're not a feminist. But then the women that do go and keep their job and hire a babysitter nanny, it's oh, you're abandoning your children? You're a horrible mother. And it's this weird situation. Men don't have to deal with that, because apparently we're not supposed to take care of children, or we don't have the capability. That goes on almost every political issue. People don't realize you can have a personal bias against, let's take another, abortion, but you can be pro-life because you're personally, you could be against it, but you're I'm not going to tell someone else what to do about it. But people don't understand there's a lot of gray areas in politics, and especially with feminists, it seems you're either this way or that way, and if you're not actively fighting for it, you're fighting against us. And but that could be said for so many political movements.
Yeah. I think there's an author, I think she's called Cynthia Enloe, and she's talks about where are the women, and I think that is the central strand to feminist theory in international relations. Where are we, and how do we help them in all of these different scenarios? It's just making sure we understand why they're important, what issues are important to women, and ensuring that these are talked about and they're part of the narrative, depending on whatever personal life choices that they make. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but
no, I get it. Sorry, I was just like, this is my last point I'll make, and then I'll go to you, Helen. Whatever, like, people talk about it, I always flash back, and because it's just a huge part of my life, is like the military, where the military is on the top is a very matriarchal society. It's mostly men. It is open, but there are some, whether you like it or not, there are a lot of jobs that don't only allow men. But that goes back to like whole other issues, and like it's a whole other conversation. But when you look at the military, most women that when they marry a soldier, Marine, a Navy, or a sailor, or an airman, they don't have a job and they're stuck at home. One, because U.S. military personnel aren't paid much, so like they can't afford for childcare. Two, it's like if your husband can be moved around on base every 4 years, you really can't get a career on your own to begin with. But you do have the opposite. I have friends that are women in the military, and their husbands are stuck in that same scenario where they're stuck at the home. There are times we have to pay attention to, and there's other times where it's like it's the system of the job, and I'm not saying that it's right or it's wrong, but that is something. Did you have something you wanted to say, Ellen?
It was kind of slightly differently related, but it was more than what you've just said. But I think that's really interesting because it is true. It's kind of you give these narratives or give these jobs to certain genders, and then it's like what happens when you flip it, I suppose. It's quite interesting. Mm-hmm. And what I was going to say was that it's kind of on the back of what Molly was saying is that you can't just assume the needs and the opinion of one woman is the same for the same like other women. Like you have to, again, I totally agree. It's this sort of idea that women should have the choice of what they want to do with their lives, and like they shouldn't be restricted due to their gender or like any other reason, their race or their religion, to do something that maybe is traditionally a man's job, I suppose. I think it's kind of what I just wanted to say. And I think that's quite an important part of feminism. And that's personally where I sit as well, quite simply. But being in the middle is not a bad thing, I don't think. You're allowed to change. My view of feminism has changed a lot as I've learned a lot more over the past year. And I came from a non-IR background, so I was completely new to this come last September, other than a few bits of sort of background I had. And people should be allowed to change their opinions. And I think that's a big, important bit. So as you learn more about feminism, you realize maybe you were pressed towards, let's say, Western feminism, and maybe you learn more about post-colonial feminism or some other Marxist feminism. I can't say it anymore. And you realize that more aligns with your views. So you should be allowed the choice to choose where you sit. So.
Absolutely. And I think as well, like, you don't have to just sit in one camp.
Mm-hmm.
There's different parts of my personality or the way that I view the world that I take different parts from different bits of feminism. So like when it comes to issues within Britain, I definitely do take on a Western feminist agenda,
mm-hmm.
because I think that's the way that's what we need to tackle feminism within Britain. But as I read about situations in other parts of the world, I'm like, actually for them, that's not the way to go about it. That's not what needs to be done there. So I feel like we shouldn't have this static view of feminism, or even the way that we practically use it, that shouldn't be static either.
I suggest anyone, see it like mostly us guys, if you have a chance to take like a sex, gender, and sexuality course or a course on feminism, take it, like a women's studies course. You're going to learn things. I hate to use this cliche, you never knew you never knew. Like there's entire thoughts and processes, and like you might understand your mother a lot better, or your sister, or any woman in your life when you look at the view and you look at the world through a feminist lens, because it is a lot different than the way men are traditionally raised, and there's a lot to be learned. There's some, as we talked about, there are some problems in it, in everything, but for the most part, it's very intellectual. One movie I really suggest everyone should watch is a movie called No Mas Babies, following the forced sterilization of women in California, Arizona, in the United States, which was it was mainly forced against immigrant women, like Hispanic-based women, and it just like whether they're U.S. citizens or not, they were forced sterilized without them knowing. You learn a lot about issues and cross topics as we were speaking. Did you have any book?
Yeah, the one that kind of came to head, and this isn't specifically about feminism, but it's really interesting. You want to know, we were obviously talking about it being a man's world. And there's a book called Invisible Woman called Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, written by Caroline Criado Perez, which is not how I probably pronounce it. But it's really interesting to learn about all the different ways a world is built for men and how all the different ways it's not built for women. Because it's fascinating to think that the world is 50% men, 50% women. Why are women considered not even necessarily a minority, but they are not considered always equal to men when they make up the same percentage of the population? So it talks, there's lots of different sections in the chat. Let me just double check. I've got it here. Some of the different chapter titles include, so there's like different things about the workplace, there's different things about design and in the household. And they kind of discuss like all the different ways that, we were saying tools are designed for men, and we were discussing how, I think in one of the chapters it discusses how, I think it was like India, how women can't use like bathrooms in the same way as men because they have to have like certain, they can't have shared bathrooms, and then in places where they can't access shared bathrooms is a huge issue of women walking miles to access a bathroom that then makes them not have time to do other things, and also makes them highly vulnerable to, sexual assault and attacks because they're walking far away, often at night as well. So there's a lot of interesting things in that book, and I'd really recommend it if anyone wants to learn more. So
yeah, absolutely. The documentary is called The World Before Her. So it looks at women in the like Miss India pageant and how they try and conform to liberal Western standards of feminism in order to make a place for themselves. But then on the other flip side of it, it follows a woman within the Indian National Party as part of the like women's brigade, and how she too is a feminist, but is for fighting for completely different issues compared to the women competing in pageants. So it's a really interesting comparison between the ideas of women within one country. And I think it touches about all the things we've like said today.
And obviously, we're also not saying if you watch or read these three things, you're not going to be an expert in feminism. There's so many different great books out there. There's books like Not Your Mother's Feminism is a book that comes to mind. There's like just so many books. Like if you just go this feminist section, and the more you learn, you're going to get different perspectives. There's not one right perspective. There might be a few wrong perspectives, but I don't think they're going to be in that section. That might be in like alternative history. But yeah, these are important things. Before we get to final thoughts, Ellen, did you want to talk about 3SJ?
Yeah, so I don't know if you know, but the 3SJ is a student strategy and security journal that's being run by a group of students from the University of Glasgow, and I think some staff are also involved. But it basically touches on a range of subjects related to security and strategy. And they released their inaugural edition in June, I want to say, May. Sorry, I think it was May, which I had an article linked to what we were talking about today. So it's looking at feminism, Marxism, and post-colonial issues in how they have Eurocentric bias in them. So like bias toward European concepts and like Western bias integrated into these theories, and like the history of Eurocentrism. So if you're interested, you can always go and read that. And then we'll kind of learn more about what we've discussed today. They also have a range of other issues they talk about. I know in the first edition, they have articles on Trump's national security strategy. They have issues on the potential of academia in informing the UN's counter-terrorism strategy. They have issues on foreign policy and like range of other things related to international relations and related to security. So yeah, give it a read.
And if someone wants to be an author in it, how do they go about it?
So if you just go to the 3SJ Facebook or website, you can just send them an email with your topic, and they've got all the details on their submission guidelines. So like length, you need an abstract, you need various different things related to that. And the process is really easy. They're all lovely, very helpful, very supportive of you being able to do that and become a published author, which is quite cool. So.
And another thing, if you want to learn more about domestic violence, sexual assault, and a lot of those issues, there's a really good resource, Shiro. It's based on Thailand and Thailand issues. However, a lot of it's applicable no matter where you live, like sexual harassment, sexual assault is sexual assault.
However, I find it very fascinating to learn about issues that we have in our own societies and other societies, because it will teach you. You can still learn. You can learn about, if we talked about Saudi Arabian issues, we've spoken about issues in India. Just because they're happening over there doesn't mean there isn't something we can't learn from.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with that said, do you have any final thoughts, anything that we didn't cover, or you have any criticism for me or something that I said? Or
No, I don't think so.
No, I think we kind of touched on quite a lot of things. I think,
Yeah.
I suppose the takeaway message is that feminism isn't necessarily, just about women's rights. It's got a lot of different aspects to it that are really integral to politics. And don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to learn more and develop your understanding of feminism and feminist theories and the range of different ones, and try and just, I suppose, just kind of develop that understanding. I mean, me and Molly, obviously, we're here talking as people that kind of know a bit about it, but there's still a heck of a lot I don't know, and a lot that Molly doesn't know.
Absolutely.
So I think, just educate yourself and be open to learning, and don't be afraid of the word feminism, because it's not a scary thing. It's just a word that's used for a plurality of other theories within it.
Yeah, absolutely. Try and fight those preconceptions of what you think feminist theory is, and go out and read, and I'm sure there'll be something that you find interesting, at least, or something that you can relate to. Yeah, just go out and read.
yeah, the one thing I also want to add is, along with don't be afraid of feminism, when we talk about masculine issues, we're talking about toxic masculinity. So anyone's listening, we're not saying masculine culture is horrible or evil. There's some positives to masculine culture. A lot of society is built on it. Could have been better under other ways. That's arguable. But what we're trying to say is become aware of toxic masculinity traits. And as we spoke about, there's toxic feminist traits. Just be aware of what we're doing. Don't be scared of things, but learn. There's no such thing as a perfect statement or a perfect idea. Everything man-made is imperfect, but there are some ways that are better than others.
On that note, I think I will just end the podcast. I did want to say thank you so much, Ellen and Molly, for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the third episode of the Rights and Wrongs podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, and share with a friend. If you'd like to be on the podcast or even interview me on some subjects, feel free to contact me at rightsandwrongspodcast@gmail.com or rightsandwrong2 on Twitter. Thank you for being a listener, and I hope you learned something. I know I did.